Shalom and welcome to the 2021 Homeschool Family Conference. And this is the third day of the conference. Can you believe we're in session 8? We're going to be continuing what we started this morning. We're going to be talking about how to teach. This is How to Teach Part 2. And my name is Ann Elliott, and I'm the creator and founder of homeschoolingtorah.com. In part 1, which we did this morning, and you'll definitely want to see that one first if you haven't had a chance, we learned 3 laws of the teacher, is what we called it. It comes from an 1800s book by John Milton Gregory, and Mr. Gregory did a great job of expressing so many laws, he called them, of teaching, just things like the law of gravity. This will happen, so you need to be aware of it if you're going to do a good job of teaching. We learned that the teacher must have knowledge if she's going to teach something. The student must pay attention if he's going to learn something. And you must be speaking the same language as each other if you're going to be able to communicate with each other. So today we're going to do 4 laws. We have the law of the lesson, the law of the teaching process, the law of the learning process, and the law of review. So we're going to jump right in. The law of the lesson. The truth that you're wanting to convey must be learned by going through something that has already been learned. Okay, you have to connect what is new to what is old. You can't start from nothing. And I think of that old Sound of Music song, and it has the phrase in it, nothing comes from nothing. I don't even know if I did that on tune. Anyway, that you have to have something there. We aren't Yehovah, the creator of the universe, who can make something come out of nothing. We can't make our students learn something if we don't have a connection there to something that they already know. So your job as a teacher is to find the point that you share some knowledge and connect that dot. Okay. That's not always as easy as it sounds. In fact, of all the lessons and laws that we're going to talk about today, I think this one can be the most difficult to remember on a day-to-day basis, that I have to explain something to somebody using something that is already in their head and connect what I'm trying to say to that piece. I can't connect it to something that's in my head. That won't do my student any good. Just because I know lots and lots of stuff about baking bread, if the person I'm talking to doesn't, then I can talk all day, but they're not going to understand. I have to put myself in the shoes of my student. This would be another way of saying this law. Now, we always have to go forward. We can't be constantly trying to go back into the past and finding out what the student knows. We want to always go forward every day, learn something new, but connect it to the old. And the next day, learn a little something new, but connect it to the old. Not on a treadmill where we're being boring and repeating the same thing. There's nothing worse as to getting up in front of it, having a teacher get up in front of us and say the same thing they said the day before. It's like, snore. We don't want that. We have to always give them something new, but we have to also be cautious not to give something so new that they have no idea what we're talking about. And you can totally see it in the eyes of the students when you do this. They're like, what? I don't get this. I think it happens in math a lot. You can definitely see this. The teacher knows how to do it. So they explain it and the student's just not getting it. Usually that's because we're not connecting it to something that they already know. And when we teach something new, we do have to master those facts before we go on. And then so it's like everything has to be connected. That's the key. We have to have a systematic way in which we teach something, and we have to systematically get the knowledge inside our head over into our students. And we have to be really systematic about being systematic and connecting everything. I want you to think about one definition of knowledge. To know something is to be able to compare it to something else and judge whether it's true or not, which goes into what I was just saying. If you really know something, it's because you connected it to something else that you knew, and you could tell that it was true or false. So if I say that this marker is orange, well, you can't really see it in the light. If I say that this marker, this highlighter is orange, you're going to go, no, it's not, because you already know from your preschool days all your colors, and you've connected that to former knowledge, and you know this is not orange, this is yellow. I know that's a very simplistic thing, but that's called discernment. And the only way we can discern something is if we know previous knowledge and then we compare it to what we just heard. So knowledge is the process of comparing and judging something new to what has already been learned. One way that we do this all the time is when we tell stories. When you listen to a friend tell a story about her dog, and she talks about how her dog did some funny trick, you immediately bring up stories in your past where you saw dogs do funny tricks. And so as friends, then you tell your story. And then your friend, while you're telling your story, connects that story to something that she knows, and she tells another story. And then you connect that story to a story you already know. And that's why friends can talk for hours and hours and hours and never stop, because they are connecting common experiences. And the whole time you're talking, you're learning new things, because as your friend speaks, there are new things that she's saying that connect to what you didn't know. And so, the benefit of having a discussion is that you can compare and contrast what you do know and what you don't know, and you can go back and forth and back and forth. And it's pretty cool. So when I say that a teacher needs to explain something to her students, the way you explain is take something familiar and compare it to the thing that is new. When you compare back and forth and take the familiar thing and usually tell a story to compare it to the new, then your student will understand. So when you're teaching an unfamiliar concept in math and you want to compare it to something, you can often go into the kitchen or into the tool shop or the garage. Think about the grocery store, and you compare it to things that are in those places, and your student knows those things. So suddenly math makes sense. Now, here is what it is not. When you're trying to explain something to a new person, just speaking in a loud, clear voice with careful enunciation is not explaining. Here's an example. If I were to travel to Israel and a native Hebrew speaker who does not know English comes up to me and asks me a question, and I, who don't know enough Hebrew to have a good conversation with that person, speak back at them in English, just because the person, okay, let's say I need to know where the bathroom is. And I don't know how to say it in Hebrew. So I say, excuse me, can you show me where the bathroom is? And the person rattles back something in Hebrew. And I say, no, excuse me, do you know where the bathroom is? That's not going to help. They don't know that word. You could talk as slow and careful and enunciate as much as you want to, but there's no common knowledge there. So you're never going to find the bathroom. What you have to do is find a translator who can connect all the dots. So when your child doesn't understand a concept in math, talking more slowly and saying, I said, what is 2 + 2? That's not going to help. Talking slower does not help. You've got to connect the dots. There's a missing piece of information there. So don't talk slower. That's just going to frustrate everyone. Here's another thing that explaining is not. Explaining is not speaking with urgency. I said, what's 2 + 2? We talked about it yesterday, don't you know? I mean, just being urgent is still not connecting the dots. That's not going to, you can't bring something up out of nothing. You just can't do it. Repeating myself exactly in the same way is not going to help. So you have a story problem and your child is saying, 2 girls went to the store. The first one bought a dress for $9.99. The second girl got her dress for 30% cheaper. The child says, I don't know how to solve this. Okay, let's read the problem again. The girl went to the store, and you just start in and read the exact same problem again. You're probably going to get the same response from your student. I don't know what to do. You have to connect. You have to reword it in a new way and share some common experience that helps the child know that maybe they have been in that situation before. You can say, it was like last week when you wanted to buy that thing, and help them understand that this is the same situation. I think that when we do some of these mistakes in explaining, what we actually do is exasperate our child. And this comes from Ephesians 6, where it says, fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath. Like we aren't always doing it in an angry way. Sometimes we just can't connect the dots. And we think that by speaking slower or louder or more urgently or repeating ourselves over and over again will help them understand, when actually they just don't understand. And you have to connect with stories and discussions and think about their past and where they've been and how you could draw in a common experience to help them understand. So, and I want to caution you, you can't go into your own experiences. That won't help. Your student wasn't there in 1992. They won't know that story. You have to come up with a common experience from their life. So You can share experiences, and this is just one of the most wonderful benefits of homeschooling compared to teaching in a classroom where 30 students coming from 30 different homes, or in a church situation where you only see them for an hour a week at Sunday school. When you have someone at home and they are your child, you share a lot of experiences. So you can very quickly come up with something. And you know what, sometimes this is where we get frustrated with our children. We're like, I know you know what I told you to do with your socks because I told you. And maybe our child didn't actually hear us. And so we all get frustrated with each other. But truly, in a home situation, you share more experiences. So if you'll just be patient with each other and come up with some of those shared experiences, your child will learn a lot faster. So the goal of all learning is to make knowledge that is new as familiar as like household things like what the color yellow is or what all your colors are. You want to make the math concepts that you're learning as familiar as how to tell your colors. Does that make sense? So that's the goal of learning, so that all of your experiences will be shared and simple and easy to get to. Basically, learning is problem solving. I'm going to show you the steps of problem solving because I want you to think about the fact that when your child is learning something new, they have a big giant question mark at the beginning of their mind of the lesson. And you have to get it to, okay, that's a shared experience. So for instance, when you're learning fractions for the very first time, your student is going, I think ratios, let's say ratios. Ratios isn't something we use every day in everyday life. Maybe some people do, in your home you might, but in our home we don't really. So when you come up to a ratio, you have to come up with a common experience. And so for the student, this is going to be problem solving. I have no idea what a ratio is. That's the first step of problem solving, to ask a question. I don't know what this is, or I'm not sure how that works, or who is Queen Elizabeth II? You know, parent probably knows, but the question's like, or the students, I have no idea who that is. Or we'll say, you know, back when Ronald Reagan was president, and the student who wasn't alive then is going, who's Ronald Reagan? So the first step of problem solving is to ask a question. And you can say with your children, do you know who Ronald Reagan is? And you can find out. And if they say no, or you can see from the blank expression, then now you have an opportunity to teach them something. And because the first step is to ask a question. So when you don't know something yourself, think about the fact that the first thing you do is go, I don't know that. You know, as adults around the table, sometimes when we're at dinner, we'll say, you know, does anyone know the answer to this? And then I'll pick up our phones and go, hey, Google, and Google answers. It's because we ask a question and we are on the process of solving a problem. The second thing is to organize ourselves. So first, ask a question. Second, organize ourselves. The very fact is that I need to know what tools I have available so that I can figure out how to solve the problem. So for me, I knew that I had Google available, so I could ask, hey, Google, and she can answer. But that's probably not the best of tools. Dictionaries, encyclopedias, concordances, using Wikipedia would be a simple tool. But of course, learning how to do advanced searches online, that's much better. Finding out who else knows this subject well, and we could ask questions of that person. What books do I have on my shelf? What library resources are available? Do I have time to go to the library today? So is time available? These are all tools that are available. And so before we can get very far in learning, we have to ask a question, then figure out what are our resources and organize all of those things together. So when you're doing history, you're going to use a different set of tools than you would when you're doing how to type. You know, that would be an entirely different set of resources, or learning wood carving would be very different from learning to bake a cake. So you organize yourself, you get all of it together, and then you start to ask questions of all of those resources. And the final step would be to solve your dilemma by evaluating which one of the answers you get back is actually useful. Not all solutions that you get back are useful. That's really easy to understand if you look up a word in the dictionary. You go to the dictionary and you want to know what a word means, and it has 4 definitions for that word. Some of them are nouns, some of them are verbs, some of them are just entirely different, because words in the English language can sometimes mean 2 entirely different things. So when you go to that dictionary, you have to solve your own question by asking which one of these in context answers the question that I had and reject all the other solutions. It's not that those solutions are always bad, but this is the process of discernment. So remember, I said that knowledge is comparing and judging between all these different options. Well, that's what problem solving is. There are a lot of possible answers, but only one is going to be appropriate for that situation. So we ask a question, we list and organize all of our resources and all of our tools, and then we solve it by comparing all the possible answers and rejecting the ones that don't fit. Really, what knowledge is, this is another definition that you could use. It's a collection of all the problems that have ever been solved since the time of Adam and Eve. You know, those things are collected into books and into libraries. They're passed down orally from teacher to student and have been for 6,000 years. And that's what knowledge is. Over time, people have compared, you know, one plant, one weed on the side of the road to another weed and said, that one is pretty and perfectly fine, and that one is poison, even though they look very similar. The collection of that knowledge is then passed down to the next generation, but a person could, not knowing that information, might have to start over, and it would be wise for them to evaluate many answers before just munching on something that could be poison. So the process of learning something is comparing and contrasting and solving problems, but we have to start with information that is already known and go to new information. So you can see that learning something is kind of complicated. It's not as simple as just, I'm going to present the fact 2 + 2 is 4. That might be simple, but it might not be so simple when you're doing a, polynomial equation in algebra. So when you start a new lesson, don't get frustrated with your students. Kind of accept, and this is hard for homeschooling moms, accept the fact that learning takes a little bit of time. It's not, you can just sit down and assign something and go on with life. If your child is really going to learn something, you're probably going to have a discussion, and you're not going to be able to hurry up and get out of the room. You're going to have to stay there long enough to be able to not exasperate each other. I told you yesterday, I got to get back in the kitchen. That's probably not going to make for good learning. So one of the things that you really need is to have time. And when you start a lesson, whatever subject it is, encourage your students to refresh their knowledge of what they learned yesterday so that you have more common experiences to get a good start on that day. So having a nice little review period at the beginning so that everybody can remember what their shared knowledge is can make it a lot easier. And that, whether that's math or history or Torah or whatever it is, that can really help. Help your students relate the new lessons to former lessons. Have a little bit of talk time and discussion. Allow students to tell stories from their own experiences. In our Sabbath congregation, every Sabbath, we have the children come up front for about 5 to 10 minutes of a children's lesson. And the teacher gets up and quickly teaches maybe a parable or a fruit of the spirit or whatever. And then the children all rush back to their seats. And one of the most difficult things about that is that you've got a whole pile of kids in the front of the congregation, and the teacher starts to talk. And very naturally, kids, let's say we were doing the parable of you are the light of the world. And the student or the teacher will just naturally ask a question. Kids, do you know what this flashlight is for? Well, kids do what kids are supposed to do, what he created them to do. And they all raise their hand and they all want to tell you some very long story about 2 or 3 minutes long about this flashlight that they had at their house that week. And as soon as they tell that story, then all the kids think of shared experiences when they also had flashlights and they want to tell their story. And all the adults in the congregation are like, oh my word, we're never going to get done in 10 minutes. All the kids want to talk. They should just be quiet. And that may be true in the context of a Sabbath congregation where you just have a few minutes, but really that's what kids are supposed to do. And in home situation, take and allow time for the children around your table to talk and share their experiences. Not only will it give you an idea of how you can now present the lesson in a way that they'll understand it better, but they are reviewing the old information that they have, so they're going to make better connections. It's actually the way we're supposed to be. Encourage students to explain the new concept that you've just taught to them ask them to explain it back to you in any way that they can. And when I say in any way that they can, they're not going to explain it as well as you could have. So you have to be patient. This is where, as a teacher, you have to develop this patience and this slow down feeling that let your kids explain it back to you. And it made, you could have your third grader explain the concept to your 5-year-old. And no, the third grader's not going to do it as eloquently as you might have done it. And the temptation will be to interrupt them and help them do it in a more adult-like fashion. But when you let them do it in their own words, they are connecting it to previous experiences and they are learning it better. If at all possible, choose story problems when you're going to work new math problems on the board before you give them their worksheet. Try to come up with problems that are from their own experiences, from something that they might have done in the past few days, or something they might have seen somebody do with their own eyes, because it will help connect. All those connections need to be formed. Make basic facts like multiplication and addition and subtraction, books of the Bible, basic facts about Torah, stories and parables of Yeshua. Make all of these things thoroughly familiar so that your child will not even have to hesitate to draw up old knowledge, and you can get a lot faster start on new knowledge. So that's why those primary years and even the early childhood time are so important, because you're laying a foundation of basic facts. Don't try to rush into middle school and high school without having down the most basic of facts. Those must be learned thoroughly. In history, to have a good understanding of the timeline before you try to bring in nuances, it really helps. So really make that your goal. By the way, though, I do want to say you can't do it all. So you might have to make a decision of what basic facts you have time to emphasize, and then really make sure that you do. This is the value of a curriculum, so that you don't have to invent the wheel, but it is also the value of actually following the curriculum. When they say to make sure you review those math facts, make sure you do. It usually is a matter of time. Parents are busy and kids don't want to have to necessarily sit there while you're antsy. And often it seems to me it's we who are antsy. So finally, keep lessons short enough that they don't lose interest, which means that you might not get much accomplished in a day. You might have a good time of review and connecting the old to the new, and then only a very short time on the new, and then a little bit of review to wrap up all those connections again. And it feels like you hardly make any progress at all. When yet, if over the span of 12, 13, 18, 20 years, you're making haste slowly, you're plodding along slowly, building a strong foundation, and ever so slightly always adding new things to it, so that by the time you have an adult, they really know what they know. You want to have your student become a discoverer, a conqueror. And every time I say these words, are you not bringing up past experiences of history class? An inventor, a conqueror of new worlds. Your student should have the attitude of a discoverer. And if you have to write that phrase down somewhere, maybe on the top of your teacher notebook, I want my students to have the attitude of discovery. But the very fact of that what discovery is means that we're sharing an experience. What a discoverer is. Who discovered America? Who discovered the first molecule? That what a discoverer is means that we're doing the same thing right here. But you want your children to always have the attitude of discovery, and it takes time. That's what I want to emphasize on that. Time and patience. All right, the fifth law. This is the law of the teaching process. And we're going to emphasize the process of learning from this perspective of the teacher for just a second. And that is that you want to emphasize that self-learning, that you should not tell your student anything that he couldn't learn himself. So there's not really here, like, I thought you were going to talk about the teacher. Well, maybe the point of the teacher sometimes is to get out of the way. Now, I'm going to say something. When I was reading this in Mr. Gregory's book, kind of made my skin crawl a little, and I just took it the wrong way. And I want to explain why I took it the wrong way. I started thinking about the fact that the Torah is our schoolmaster that leads us to Messiah, right? We have to have the Torah. You have to have the teacher being the schoolmaster if you're ever going to understand who the Messiah is. But then we also know in Romans chapter 1 that everyone in the entire world is without excuse, because even nature teaches them. They have eyeballs of their own, and they can discover who the Messiah is without anyone teaching them. And I'm like, no, we need a teacher. There's so many times that we told in the Torah we're supposed to teach. We have to have a teacher. But then there's also the grace of God, and the Ruach himself is a teacher who lives and dwells within. But I guess that is still a teacher. See, I'm going round and round on this. I'm like, why would the most important thing for a teacher to do at times is to stay out of the way and tell the student nothing that he couldn't learn for himself? Well, I hope we can wrestle some of these ideas. I didn't get it all figured out. Some of the reasons why you don't want your student to always have to depend on you as a teacher is because A, it saves time. How much time do you actually have to sit around and teach all day? You probably still do need to cook supper and make laundry. And by the way, your student's going to grow up someday and they're not going to be at home forever. So they won't always have you to be their teacher. B, maybe some students are weak and they need help. They might be weak in an area and they just cannot understand that. I'm thinking of students with special needs, or students that just never got a good understanding in reading. And so they have trouble sounding out new words and they can't comprehend difficult historical texts. So they're weak and they need a teacher to come along and explain something. And I think this is what the apostles were talking about when they said that the Torah is our schoolmaster to bring us to the Messiah. We're weak and we might have nature to teach us. And yes, we are without excuse, but not everybody can look at a flower and think of a creator. Some people think of evolution and they're just weak in that area and they need someone to come along and explain. Even the Ethiopian eunuch who is no slough. I mean, he was a really smart guy. He needed Philip to come up into the chariot with him and explain the scroll of Isaiah because he didn't understand it. So sometimes we're weak in areas. And so those are the times we need a teacher. And then other times we just have an urgent need for information. We got to get this done. So this is the time we go, hey, Google, I don't have time to have a really long discussion with my neighbor who worked for 50 years in that industry. I just need the answer right now. Sometimes this is good in spelling. Your kids are trying to write a paragraph. You ask them to write a paragraph, but they don't know how to spell the word broccoli. That's a hard one for me. So you could say, now, honey, I want you to go look up the word broccoli in the dictionary. Of course, they're writing about the value of vegetables today, and they're going to write about 10 different vegetables. And you wanted them to have it done before lunch, but you're going to then totally distract them from that task and take them over to the dictionary, teach them how to do alphabetical order, teach them how to understand word etymology. And you're so off track by that point that you can't even remember what the original paragraph was about. Sometimes it's just, there's an urgent need to learn how to spell the word broccoli. So just tell them. Just say, this is how you spell it, and forget the dictionary that day. And at that point, you might make a mental note that sometime I need to teach them dictionary skills. But for today, I'm just going to tell you how to spell it. You want your student to become a discoverer of truth, though, ultimately. You do want them to know how to use the tools. Because remember, to learn something, you have to first ask questions. Second, learn how to use the tools and organize it all. And third, to evaluate which one is true. So to do that, you're going to have to give your student a chance to practice that. You want them to become the discoverer of truth themselves. You want them to find out the information for themselves. So they get lots of practice asking questions, looking at the tools, and evaluating which one's true. And of course, they're going to do that with your oversight at this point because they're young, they're weak. So you want to help them. You want to be the school master, but not necessarily teach them every little bit of information. Can we actually learn without a teacher? Let's think about this from a biblical perspective. Could Adam learn without a teacher? Did he learn everything without a teacher? I don't think so. I'm gonna take you over to Genesis chapter 2 real quick. Let's go to Genesis 2:15. It says, Yehovah Elohim took the man, Adam, and put him in the garden of Eden to tend it and keep it. And he commanded the man, saying, and then he gave him some commands. And then he brought him his wife, and then they named the animals together. And down in chapter 3, we learn verse 8. It says, they heard the sound of Yehovah Elohim walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid themselves from the presence of Yehovah Elohim among the trees of the garden. So it was the habit of Yehovah to come into the garden every day and walk with them and talk with them and do things with them. So I would say, I think we could make a case that Adam didn't just learn everything by discovery. Now we know he discovered the process of when he was naming the animals, he discovered that he did not have a partner like all the animals did. So that was the process of discovery, but his schoolmaster, Yehovah, was right there guiding that lesson. So, and Yehovah gave direct commands: do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I want you to tend the garden. I want you to be fruitful and multiply. There were a lot of commands. And I kind of wonder that the entire content of the Torah, at least the basic laws of what we should and should not do to others, were probably communicated, but I can't make a case for that. Probably it was communicated which things are good for food and which things should not be eaten. I would think that there were a lot of things that were communicated, but I can't say that 100% for sure. But I do know that at least in a few things, even the very first human being was not entirely without a teacher. Now, why do we need schools? I mean, obviously he could discover a ton by himself, and he lived to be 900 and some years of age. So he had a lot of time. That was not his problem. So why do we need schools? Well, to connect what we are discovering with what has already been discovered, which we'd call truth. So let's think about Eve. She's in the garden. Adam, before she was before she was made, Adam was told, do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Eve wasn't there. No common connection. I don't know what Adam told her. I do know that when you get to chapter 3, and Hasatan asks her, what did Adam say about this? What did God say about this tree? She gave the command a little wrong. She didn't word it the same way. So whatever their shared experience was, it wasn't exact. And I don't know where Adam was. He might have been right there, but he was daydreaming about something else. But he obviously wasn't actively participating in that discussion. So Eve went on to sin. Yes, she sinned. But according to the book of First Timothy, she was deceived because she didn't have complete knowledge that Adam had. He did not do a good job of passing it on. She did not connect the thing in front of her with actual truth. That's why we need teachers. We need people to be consciously, intentionally passing on information accurately and truthfully so that we're not deceived like Eve. Secondly, we need schools and teachers because we don't want to waste our life. We don't want to waste time. We only have so much time, so much energy, so much money. We don't want to have people make mistakes and have consequences like dying because they didn't know truth. So to save all of that unnecessary waste and trouble and pain in life, we need teachers to help us and to pass things along from their shared experiences, which they got from the ones in front of them, which go all the way back to Adam. And thirdly, we need teachers and we need schools because while our teachers are overseeing us, we can be under their supervision and make good decisions and get a good track record of solving problems, gathering tools, and making good discerning choices about all of the solutions. And all the times that we do that right, and of course, they're guiding us, they're protecting us, they're keeping us safe, but we gain confidence. And in that very closely monitored environment where we can make mistakes safely without any terrible, deathly consequences, they can oversee, but we are learning how to do it well, and we get confidence. Over and over again, we do things successfully and someone's going, good job. And that confidence just increases and increases until the day comes that we have to do it by ourselves. We're not afraid. A lot of times fear comes because we don't know what to expect and we feel alone. And that's not what we want for our students. We want to give them that confidence, but we don't have to do it all for them. You know, when your child is struggling with math, you don't pick up the pencil and solve it. There, I did it. Now you know how to do it. That's not what I mean. Instead, you need to sit with them, help them realize that they have a problem, what tools are available to help them solve that math problem, come up with a solution, and then help them to discern if the solution makes sense. In math, we would call that check the problem and make sure that does it actually make sense in the real world. And then they go, yeah, I did it, Mom, I did it. You were there the whole time. But you let them do it on their own with your oversight. And now they have some confidence. And now you might try it with another problem. And then you might walk away to the kitchen, but you're with an ear sight and kind of peek to see if they're getting the third problem right. And when you see that they are, their confidence levels are increasing. and you have done a good job of teaching. So what motivates children to learn? Young children, I think, are motivated often by bright colors and action and animal stories and stories of other kids just like them. Everything is very concrete. They can touch it and they can feel it. But as your kids get older, and you're going to see this as you come up towards puberty and even before, the older a person is, the more they are motivated by their thoughts and by the way that makes them feel. And they reflect and they think about things and they compare and they start to live more here than by all the outward external actions. So that's how children grow. So when we are learning, we need to keep in mind the age of our students and not try to expect our little tiny children to think like an adult, and not expect our teenagers to have to do everything with bright colors and animal stories, because they're past that. Teaching our children is a little bit like planting seeds, and they're going to go through levels and stages of maturity, and it takes a lot of time, like we're talking 20 years, and we have to protect them. The job of the gardener is to watch for the storms that are coming and shoo the birds away and keep poison away from our plants, and don't let the sun come down too hard on them. Make sure that we feed and water them, but we have to do it for the entire growing season. And if we let up down our guard for just one day, the foxes come in and ruin the vine. When Yeshua talks in Matthew 13 about the parable of the sower going out to seed, and he has 4 kinds of seed, he talks about seeds that are planted on the wayside and they're devoured by birds. And he clearly says in verse 18 of Matthew 13 that those listeners did not understand, so they couldn't learn. And so the very first step is making sure your children actually understand it all. But that's not the end of learning. The second place he flung his seed was on stony ground, and it sprang up quickly because they understood, but it was scorched by the sun. And it's like a child who's like, I get it. And then we let them loose to never check to see if the information really took deep hold. And when it gets difficult, they give up. This, again, I can think of math. Like the child's like, I understand how to do it, Mom. Don't keep bugging me about it. I get it. And so we let them go. And of course, predictably, later down on the math sheet, the problems get much harder and they have multiple steps involved. And the child's like, this is too hard, throws their pencil down. So they needed the teacher to stay longer and to guard them against the sun and the hot part of the day, and to still be with them and fan them off a little and offer them a drink and encourage them to keep going when the going gets hard. Students should not only work because you told them to do it. I told you to do it, so therefore you have to encourage them. You have to be with them and cheer them on. And you're the same way. You don't always do things just because of self-control. Sometimes you need someone to keep you motivated, and so you don't get overwhelmed. Students can borrow some of the love of learning from you until they have grown up as plants and can have their own love of learning. So give it. Be sure to give some of your love and encouragement and excitement to them. Keep them going, especially on difficult things, just like the stony ground that's getting scorched. Thirdly, he threw it out, and there were thorns that choked the seed. He says clearly in Matthew 13 that these are worries and riches, which I would call distractions. So if you want your child to learn and they understand the math problem and they've gotten through the difficult part, so you decide to flip the TV on, and now the distraction is there, how are they going to really learn? So don't allow distractions to come in. And again, this would come into allowing enough time to complete the lesson so that you don't have to do every subject in the car as you're riding around it every day. Distractions can really ruin education. I know that's been a difficult one for us, health problems, having a new baby be born, company coming to visit. We were just learning something and now it's time for the feast, and we're going to put it away for a couple of weeks. And that can really hinder learning because constant distractions come in and you don't have enough time to actually get a lesson done. The fourth ground that he threw the seed on was good ground. And this is ground that has been cultivated and composted and everything. The rich nutrients are there. And the farmer has gotten rid of the birds. They have sheltered the plants from the sun and given them plenty of encouragement and water. They have kept the thorns from choking, so no distractions were allowed in. And the result was it yielded 100-fold, 60-fold, and 30-fold in the parable. That means the child heard, they understood, they all the weeds and distractions were gone, and they were able to bear fruit. So as a parent, think about the long-term commitment that you are making to homeschooling, that and you can't always prevent everything. And maybe if your children don't understand something, you don't blame them and say, well, we covered that in third grade math. Well, maybe you had distractions going on in third grade math and you better start over. It's not always the student's fault. So that's why we're calling this the law of the teaching process. The responsibility of the teacher in helping the child learn everything for himself that he could learn for himself means that you are there to shelter and be the gardener, to make sure that the ground is good and protected. The more knowledge your student has, the more understanding will come. So as the plant gets stronger and bigger, the more likely good fruit is going to come from it. Think about how you study the Bible. When you were young, you may have read the Bible here or there. You may have heard it at church, but that day came that you understood Torah, and that desire to read it over and over and over again brought so much understanding. So the more knowledge you have, the more understanding of what the Bible says that you have, the more everything else makes sense. And it continues like that. People who are older in the faith that have read their Bible every year for 30 years have read through the Torah so many times that they can't even count how many times it has. Of course, they have more understanding than someone that's going through it for the first time. Knowledge grows by being fostered like that, by going over it again and again. And as you go over things again and again, as we do Torah year after year, we hear it read every Sabbath. As you go over the same multiplication tables in fifth grade that you were doing, the foundation for back in first grade, as you go over that information over and over again, you can inspire your children to keep wanting to learn by pointing out the value of it. Because as your child gets older and they're not inspired just by pretty colors and animal stories, you can inspire them to learn by going, you know what, someday you're going to have a job and this is going to really help you. And you can tell a story. And now you can give them one of your experiences, and they're going to think about that as they do their math. And they're going to go, oh, cool, maybe I could do that. Or, oh, I could make some money doing that. And it helps them. So foster that learning, but keep repeating it over and over again. Tell them why they're doing it. How many people have said, I don't know why we learn algebra? You've got to tell them why. Why are you learning grammar? Tell them why. Connect your emotions. As you get on your soapbox at home, which, your kids will probably tease you for because you do it often. But your passion and excitement for something, your emotions that are coming out, or as you read a story together and you cry over, a sentimental part of the chapter book, all of your emotion inspires them to love learning as well. So join with your students when they're discovering things in science, when they're doing math together, do it with them. Join together and let some passion and excitement come out of you for it. Don't just let them go be discoverers, go discover with them. When you ask questions, don't be in a rush to get back to something more important than homeschooling. When you ask a question, give them time to think. Don't try to finish the sentence for them. Let them put it in their own words, and let them have a chance to ask you questions, because as we talked about in the first session, students show their mental activity by putting things into language and asking questions, by putting things into words. So you've got to give them time to do that. When they ask you a question, you can inspire that by asking them a question right back and getting them to think. Some of the questions that you can ask if you're not sure what to ask, and maybe the curriculum cannot provide all of this for you because it can't be there in your room with your shared experiences, okay? Curriculum can't do that. But you might be drawing a blank. What kind of question would I ask them? So in our writing curriculum, we talked about the 6 serving men: who, what, when, where, why, and how. So if you need to get a question going and get some learning going in your home, you can ask them, well, who did that? Do you know where that was? Well, what did they do? Oh, how? Why? So, and it can get that's an easy way to ask questions. Again, don't hurry. Now, before we go on, I want to just, so we have another law to cover. I want to talk about one little side note. And that is children who, instead of asking questions and answering questions and having good discussion, these are children that argue. They think they are wise. It's called wise in their own eyes. And I think you're going to know the difference. There's a child who wants to learn and they ask questions, or they tell you what they learned yesterday. And then there's the child that's just a know-it-all. And they're going to tell you, Mom, that at their big second grade maturity of wisdom, they know so much more than you. And that you need to watch out for. Do not allow your child to argue with you. Now, if they're asking a sincere question, that's fine. But you need to discern the difference between asking sincere questions and being an arrogant arguer. Philippians 2:14 says, do everything without complaining or arguing. That would be another very good verse to put on your homeschool wall. Okay, let's go into law number 6. This is the law of the learning process. So we're going to look at the process of learning from their perspective now. And this is a lot like my seeds. The student must reproduce truth that is to be learned. They have to be able to reproduce it. Now, let me show what I mean. Reproducing truth. That means that they can tell you what they learned. And that's how you know that they've learned. This is a little bit like the law of the language that we talked about earlier in our first session. But reproducing information and knowledge is not listing off all the things you memorized, okay? Just because your child can word for word tell you everything that happened in history from the year 600 AD to the year 700 AD does not mean that they've learned it all. It just means that they can list off facts. Just because they can list off the books of the Bible doesn't mean they know what is in each book of the Bible. Just because they can list off 500 memory verses does not mean they know how to act from applying scripture to their life. So memorization and repetition of facts those are both important. We're going to talk about how in a second, but they are not the end all. That's not the goal of learning, okay? Rather, you want your child to learn how to investigate so that they can learn new things later on their own, okay? So for instance, if a child can say what he has learned in his own words with true understanding, now that's learning. So for instance, if you have your child recite John 3:16, word for word, perfectly good, that's fine, especially for a young child or a new person learning. But if they can explain to you in their own words what John 3:16 means, maybe even giving an example from their own life, now you know they're really starting to learn, okay? That's the difference. You want your students to be able to reproduce what they have learned. For instance, a child, it's important that they do copy work. We want them to copy the Torah. That's very important. And in fact, it's listed for kings that they are required to copy the Torah in their own hand. But does that mean that the king completely understands the Torah and is committed to obeying it and could explain the Torah in his own words? No. It doesn't mean that. Copy work is not the goal. Copy work is a tool to get you to the goal. You do have to know the original in order to put it in your own words or reproduce it. So you can't rush this. There is a place for copying things exactly. Absolutely. But that's not the goal. That's all I'm trying to say. And it takes time. This is why kindergarten through 12th grade is necessary to get so many facts in. Yes, you do want them to learn their multiplication tables. Absolutely. They should know them like this automatically, like we were just saying a little earlier. But to be able to explain why 6 times 8 is 48 is so much more valuable. You want your child to seek evidence for the knowledge that they have. In other words, you want your child to be able to give a reason for what he believes. And to be said in a simpler way, you want your child to know why. You need to understand what the Torah says, and it's great that you have it memorized and you can say it word for word, but that your child knows why God commanded that. And it's not always possible, I know. It's very difficult to search out some of these things, but do you see why that's a higher level of actually understanding? Peter says, we are always to be ready to give a reason for the hope that is within us. It's fantastic that we have hope, but if we can't put it into words for somebody else, we don't necessarily understand that hope very well, do we? Finally, we need to know how all of our information could be used in the world. The reason you go to school is not so you can get a diploma. The reason you go to school is so that you can learn how to use it in your life, so that you can actually live as an adult. That's the real reason. So you want your child to have knowledge, and then you want your child to have an understanding. That's knowing why. But most of all, you want them to have wisdom, and that's applying all of that in a correct way to a certain situation. That's the goal. Wisdom is the goal, not knowledge. Understanding's cool. It's a start. But wisdom is the goal. So, when we're learning something, I want you to stop thinking about your kids for a second. Just think about yourself. How do you learn something? Well, first of all, you learn what the lesson says. You might read a book and learn something new. Maybe you're learning about herbs. And then you have to ask yourself, what did that mean? You might have to look something up in a dictionary and have a discussion with an herbalist friend. And then how would I say this in my own words? Well, you might go up to your husband and you tell him everything you learned. And in your own words, you're telling him everything that you read in that book. And you say, why is that true? And your husband asks you a question. Well, I don't know about that. I don't think that's actually true. So then you have to go and look it up in the medical journals and find out why that was actually true and give a reason back to your husband. But none of that learning about herbs is of any good if you don't actually use the herb and get better. So you could skip all the rest of it and go straight to the use, but then you might use it incorrectly and you might choose the wrong solution. So it is very important to know what knowledge is, what it means, how to say it in our own words so that we really know we understand it, to know the evidence for it. So we know that that's actually the right decision and then actually use it in our life. So for your children, let's think about what this looks like in education. What does the lesson say? That's reading it. That's copying and dictation. So those things are very, very important. We have to first get the knowledge out and start, putting it, presenting it. But second, what does it mean? We have to explain. This is where discussion comes in. And when the Torah says we have to talk about the Yehovah's commands with our children when we walk, when we sit down, when we rise up, when we lie down, that discussion is absolutely essential. We have to tell our children what things mean. We have to make sure the connections are there and they actually understand it. How do we know they understood it? Well, can they say it back to you in their own words? This is where they translate back to you what you said, and you confirm that you are using the same language, one with each other. And it doesn't have to be verbal. Some of this can be done by writing an essay or answering the questions at the end of a chapter. Then you need your students to learn to discern with all the tools available to us in 2021. How do we know it's true? This is a key step that I think a lot of Torah people, fall into conspiracies and go into crazy things because they never learned how to check evidence, to compare one or two witnesses, or I'm sorry, it shouldn't be one or two, it should be two or three witnesses to make sure that what we are studying is true. Doesn't Proverbs say that every man sounds correct until another man comes along to question him? We have to know why we believe what we believe, and we have to prove evidence for it. So you have to teach your children how to use tools and how to study and how to use a scientific method and how to evaluate and discern truth from fiction. And then finally, what is the good of it? Do not let your children graduate and leave home until they know how to use the information that you've taught them in their daily life. That's the whole point. That was all the rest of it was to get you to that point. So when the scriptures say, "Hear, O Israel," at the beginning of the Shema, what we call the Shema, because it's the first word, to hear, to Shema is really all of those steps. It's not just hearing, but it goes all the way through all 5 steps to the point of doing. Hearing is a really big deal. Now, keep in mind the age of your student. Maturity brings, as a child gets older and older, they ask why. So a baby, you teach them how to do something, but by age 3 or 4, they go, why? And you have to give them reasons. And really that happens in elementary level kids too. At the young ages, you teach them how to do math. But then as they get older and they have to start applying it to more difficult math, they ask why? And sometimes that's when it's difficult to give them a reason, and you'll have to show them how to use the tools and find out. It is incredibly important to move through all 5 steps, or your children will be like Eve, deceived. Do not just take the word of a textbook, but teach them how to back it up with the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, how to look up evidence and discern truth. And that's even true from the Bible. We know that the Bible is true. We believe that it is true. I believe that it is true. I could go on and on about how the word of God is always true in every word. It is true. But can you prove it? And if you cannot, you should take some time in your next school year to start learning how to prove that the word of God is true. Your children need to know why it's true, not that you said so, but why. What is the evidence for it? And that should be true of every subject that we talked about. But then most of all, don't neglect that application. Make sure that you apply it to their real, truly everyday life. That what are you going to use this for? We're going to, in conclusion, give you the law of review. That the completion and test of true knowledge is made by reviewing and applying it. What I just said about application and review. If you won't know something until, and you won't know your children know it until you reviewed it and reviewed it and reviewed it and applied it to actual circumstances that they have to do something with it. Why do we review? Well, there are several reasons. Number one, we review because it perfects the knowledge that we already have. If it's day 2 and you go back over something that you learned on day 1, that you perfect it. You find out if there are any weaknesses in their understanding, and you can firm it up. And if, let's say that it's year 1 and you're going through ancient history, and then you go to year 2 of history and you start back over at ancient Babylon, and some of that information you've covered before, but it's in a fresh new way from a new perspective. And so it firms it up and it makes it stronger. The second thing is to confirm that it's true. Remember, I was talking about 2 or 3 witnesses. When you review something, you're coming at it maybe possibly from a different angle, or different voice is telling you the same thing. In science, we might read and look up all the Bible verses about that scientific fact, and then we might look up in a dictionary what the words mean. And then we might go to several different YouTube channels and watch them just explain it. And then we might do a science experiment so that we can see with our own eyes. And all of that review confirms that the knowledge was actually true. Thirdly, we review to make the knowledge ready to be used. Okay. For instance, you can teach that 4 times 7 is 28, but until you review it over and over again, that child doesn't have it well enough learned that they could use it at the grocery store when they quickly have to decide what 4 times 7 is. Did I say 4 times 7? I think so. I already forgot. If you want to have the knowledge ready, you have to review enough times that it becomes automatic. And that's a lot of review. That's not just 1 or 2 times. Don't expect your kids to learn it quickly. I think you could say 7 times or 7 times 70. It would be a better, a number of times that you have to review things that must be ready to be used at a moment's notice. And finally, if you're going to be able to use knowledge in your everyday life, you have to know it so well. You have to review enough times that you could actually apply it. So you can know that 4 times 7 is 28, but can you measure 28 and 4 times 7 in a multitude of ways out in the tool shop so that you can make an accurate piece of furniture? No time is more profitable in your homeschooling than review. And that's not how we normally think. We think that the lesson where we talk and discuss and explain is the most important part. But I actually want to say that the review is the most important part, because if your child can't bring that information up out of their deep recesses of their brain, then how did they learn it? How are they ever going to use it? So this is, again, why do we read the Torah every year? And the synagogues, as it says in Acts 15, it's read. Moses is read every Sabbath day. Why? Why? For Sabbath after Sabbath, for 2,000 years or more, must we listen to the same thing over and over again? Why do we read our Bible through every calendar year? Because every time you read it, you see it with fresh eyes. You bring to light new things that you never saw before. As the days and the weeks go by and you talk about the same thing over and over again, maybe you have a word for your school year and you talk about that word every day for an entire school year. Well, as those days and weeks go by, you see things you didn't see back on day 1. And on top of that, you're at a new point of view. You've never lived through Thursday before and all of the events of Thursday, and Thursday might have brought some new experience that makes the topic more understandable than it would have been if you only talked about it back on Monday. The position of the observer has changed, quite literally. If you are examining, what's that thing about an elephant? A whole bunch of blind people trying to explain what an elephant is, and they're all touching it and feeling it. And one of them's up by the head, so they explain it this way. And one of them's down by the tail, so he explains it this way. But if the person who is blind could have explained it from every possible point of view before coming to the conclusion, they might have had a more accurate understanding. And so that's why review is so important. It's like ideas have to incubate in our mind. And this brings me back to that seed again. Things have to grow. It takes time for something to grow. And review has to keep happening through that whole time. Keep bringing it back up to the surface again, like a cow chewing her cud, bringing that grass back up again and doing it again, and then swallowing and then bringing it back up. And she's getting a lot more nutrition out of it than someone who just swallows quickly. What is a test? Well, a true test is to find out what the student remembers and is able to use. and able to apply to a situation. Just rattling off facts again is not really knowing things. So a good test doesn't just have them rattle off facts. Those kinds of tests are more like a review in themselves. It's fine to use a test to just check facts, but it's not the end. And you don't know if the student really knows it. You just know that you've reviewed it that day in just a different way. And we called it a test. A real test makes sure that the student knows what he remembers and he's able to use it. This is why in Homeschooling Torah, we repeat levels in our math curriculum. So we have K and 1, and then 2 and 3, and then 4 and 5, and 6 and 7, and some people review it again in 8th. We review the same pages. They do the exact same worksheets again and again and again. It's not because we're trying to bore them, but because we're trying to make sure we had a chance to review. And the child is a whole entire year older with an entire year's worth of experiences that now could be related to that subject and connect the dots, and their understanding will be so much richer. So reviewing things over again is not bad. This is why you teach 4 years of world history when they're young and then come back when they're older and teach those same 4 years again. It's why you teach American history when they're young and then come back and they're older and teach it, but this time from the perspective of government and economics, because that review through something again and again and again really stabilizes it. They're going to have new questions to ask, new experiences to go, oh my goodness, I saw a movie about that, or I read a book about that. And now they can understand it. So when you're younger, lots of repetition, but as the child gets older, you're going to give a deeper restudy of the same information. And when they're even older, you're going to really concentrate on applying it. That's why I give a lot of papers to your older children and say, you know, as you're learning about George Washington and how he acted at Valley Forge, I want you to write a paper about the character qualities that you need to have in your life, just like George Washington. That's going to be pretty deep, and they're going to be able to use it in their life. This is the difference between someone who just makes bread from a mix that they buy at the store to an artisan bread maker who's been working in a French pastry shop for 30 years. This person over here has reviewed it over and over again and applied it to actual life for that whole entire time. I have a question though for you. How are you as a teacher going to remember to actually review all of this? This is the value of a curriculum and having a lesson plan, because you're not going to remember all this either. You're not going to remember that you wanted to teach that subject. And frankly, the curriculum writers, they don't even remember what all they were supposed to teach, because you can't. Your brain can't hold it all. And you do have a lot of things going on, distractions and stuff in your own life. So it's valuable to have a lesson plan to look at, to remember what it was that you wanted to teach, sticky notes to remind you, lists of things that you wanted to remember to talk about. Go ahead and write in your book when you have an idea, or write in your book what you talked about, so that in a couple of years, when you come back to that page, you'll remember what was discussed, and now you can add new experiences to it. This is why you highlight in books as you read them, and then go back and review all of the highlights, because it helps really firm up what you learned. This is why we use worksheets. This is why we do notebooking pages, which I love so much. And I hope you'll go. I'm going to put a link to the video about notebooking pages, because these are a fantastic way to review. To have your students list out all the things that they learned in that lesson. Well, who are all the people? And let's see if we can remember who all the people were we read about in these 3 chapters. And I want you to tell me something you know about that person. This is why you make tables of the kings of Israel and charts. This is why you make timeline books. This is why you make maps, many maps, so you have a very good understanding and you review constantly. But from the perspective and the connection of who you were talking about in history that day, you might make a map of Italy in geography that's entirely different from a map of Italy when you're discussing the first pope. And the different connections will really make that map of Italy stick. You make plans, you make drawings, you write down statements and sentences. Today I learned, and then write it in their own words. Little bit, some other time, today I learned this, and for these 3 reasons. And now you have a paragraph. Today I learned this, but I also learned that some people believe this, but I think they are wrong because the evidence says this. And now you have an essay. And then of course you could write a 10-page paper and so on. And then time to answer questions and ask questions and go back and forth. All of these are ways to review. The times of your lesson that you need to review at the beginning. You need to, at the end, review again and ask them to verbally summarize everything that you just taught them. That may not even be the end of the day, but maybe the end of a chapter in your history book, and maybe 3 chapters that you read that day. So you're going to stop and pause and ask them to verbally summarize. You can stop often and do that. After several lessons, like once a week or after a unit, do a good discussion and review. Even if it's not in the curriculum, pause and take a couple days to just do the review and then jump back into the curriculum. I think I would estimate that about 1/3 of all your time in school should be spent in review. So you can kind of gauge how close are you to that. Again, make haste slowly. It's not about finishing the book. It's not about finishing 180 lessons that are in the curriculum. It's about teaching your children and seeing that they actually learned it. When you're in the middle of a lesson, pause to reference something that you know they know. Encourage them to put their hand up while you're reading and interrupt you in a nice, polite, respectful way, and ask you a question if they don't understand what something means. Pause to look up a difficult vocabulary word that might be in a chapter book you're reading aloud. Don't be too busy to do this review and discussion. So those are all the 7 laws of the teacher. And I wanted to point out that in Homeschooling Torah, our lessons are arranged according to hear, learn, keep, and do. And I'm going to put a reference to that below the video so you can go and find out more about what I mean. The hearing is to Shema, to totally understand what you heard, not just to hear it with your ears, and hear it enough that you want to take action on it. To learn is to come back and apply it in many different ways, and to come at it from many angles and to research the evidence behind it. To keep is to guard it. That means to review and review and review and review. That's where we put all the review stuff in Homeschooling Torah. And to do is where you actually have to go and think about how we would solve an actual problem with the information that we learned. Many times that's with a hands-on project or thinking about it in the real world. Home is the best place to do this. Your kids aren't going to be able to have the time to do this at church. In fact, at church, in your Sabbath fellowship or your synagogue, your congregation, or even your home fellowship, according to 1 Corinthians 14, the women and the children are supposed to be silent as the men talk. They're supposed to be respectful, only talking one at a time. You're not going to have the time or the ability to do all of the things that we just talked about, to, have the children in the middle of a children's story ask a lot of questions and go on and tell all of their experiences. That's not the time and the place for it. Home is the best place for this. Now you do have the time and the place. And when you're done with your lessons and you go on into the kitchen to make supper and you go and do laundry and you're cleaning the bathroom and you have to go get groceries and you're going to run to this co-op activity and take your kids to this gym day, those discussions can keep going. You don't have to stop just because you got away from the dining room table. But I also wanted, we're going to go into tonight when we come back in our last session for today. We're going to talk about how to actually plan so that all of this can actually happen, because I hope that I've actually made you feel a little bit overwhelmed at this point, because now I want to come back and make it practical. And how do you actually make a lesson plan for today and a lesson plan for a year and a plan of action long-term for an entire education of your children? Because without a plan, this is going to be really difficult. You even probably need to plan a schedule as to how you're going to get through your day and get all this done and keep your sanity. So I hope you'll come and join us back tonight as we talk about how to plan. So shalom, and I hope you'll check out the resources below the video just to kind of add a little bit more to what we talked about so you can review it in a different way. So shalom.